Hi, everyone. This is Heena Lotus from Heena Lotus Media. Welcome to my podcast. I'm super excited for the episode today. We are going to be covering Pakistan under potentially a series, depending on how we do and how much we get through, called Pakistan Decoded. We have a million questions. Usually, I do interviews. This is going to be a little bit more conversational. The reason I say that is the guest speaker today is Haydar. He is phenomenal. He is my go-to when it comes to anything Pakistan. And I feel like whenever him and I start discussing Pakistani politics, one question will turn into 28 different conversations encompassing history, encompassing geopolitics, and international relations. I feel like we should probably write a book at some point, but it depends on how this podcast goes, obviously. That all being said, I'd love to introduce Hey there. If you can please introduce yourself for anyone who may not know you, kind of go over like your education, what you do, and then we'll get straight into the questions.
Thank you so much for having me, Hina. My name is Heather Sayed. I am an activist and until very recently a musician, which I do dabble in a bit here and there, as well as what can be described as a political commentator and writer. I have a background in political science as well as the law, in which I have begun practicing as of recently, and much of my work has to do with human rights and international law, as you can imagine. And yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. I am super excited to get into this episode. The reason I thought it was really important to address Pakistan is because it's such a key player in the geopolitical world. It has such a complex history. And yet, whether we're talking about Western MSM or MSM on the Pakistani side or Middle Eastern MSM, or SWANA, I should say, there's just a lot of disinformation. I think that there's a lot of confusion as well. Not to say that, Heather and I are scholars by any means on the subject, but I think we've done enough research and have understood enough concepts to start educating people and having conversations around Pakistani discourse. It's a key player in the geopolitical world, but it's something that's not reported on outside of current events. And I think the only way that you can truly understand Pakistani current events is if you understand the geopolitical world as well as the history behind it. So we wanted to actually start off this episode talking about Imran Khan. He is all over the news, obviously not for good reasons. And we wanted to go into the history of how he came into power and then kind of go into international relations after we cover him. The first question that I wanted to get into was the rise to power for Imran Khan. Hey there, I just wanted to get your thoughts. When it came to his rise in, like, let's say the 2010s, he was doing a lot of commentary around Afghanistan, US foreign policy. PTI was becoming really, really popular. Can you kind of go over how that came about and, go over anything else that you think is pertinent to that subject?
Sure, yeah. There's a few different things when it comes to understanding Imran Khan and sort of the role that he's played in Pakistani politics, why he's such a polarizing figure, as well as how he's kind of, navigated the political landscape there, how he's kind of embedded himself in the institutions and the political circus as opposed to structure there. Um, and it kind of, you need to know the backstory of, I'm sure our listeners will already know this, but his prominence as an athlete, as a sort of celebrity figure throughout the Western world, as well as in Pakistan, he was revered and adored universally, right? This was an individual who was just, he ascended that, apex of fame and kind of just notoriety as well. But he was very, very, like the poster child of Pakistan, and how it was kind of seen in the world.
And he
Um,
it wasn't just Pakistan. The cool thing about him is that he was a global icon. That is
as
something that he was a household name at the end of the day.
Mhm. And like I remember growing up hearing about him as a cricketer from my dad, and again, everyone, whoever you were, it didn't matter your politics, whatever that was for you, you loved Imran Khan because he was that sort of national hero, right? And in a country where you've had so many of these overarching figures, he kind of stood atop that. And that's what he kind of used to enter into the political landscape. And this happened during mid to late 90s for the first few years where he founded the Pakistani Tehreek-e-Insaf and his political party, and he kind of attempted to enter into politics at a time when a lot of well-to-do friends of his who were scholars or they were already part of the political infrastructure there. They tried to talk him out of it because they felt that he didn't know what he was getting himself into. And from what I've gathered at that time, he did have this idealized version of what he wanted to achieve, and that kind of brings us to his work in terms of his philanthropic work and making the Shaukat Khanum Hospital, which was this cancer hospital free of charge for overwhelmingly poor people who couldn't afford treatment in any other case. And so he had this sort of approach from the very beginning, even while he was playing cricket, in taking the initiative to kind of help people, right? And he used a lot of his acclaim and his fame to do a lot of charitable drives, donations, and he was well known for those things and regarded and respected, which, by the way, recently in some of the Epstein leaks, it had been mentioned that in whatever discourse was taking place in some of the correspondence, there was mention of how at one point when Jeffrey Epstein was attempting to, I believe he was trying to get into polio vaccine distribution in Pakistan, and he was looking for ways to enter into, the healthcare industry in Pakistan. He was referred to Imran Khan, and that's kind of how he first um, just gained acclaim throughout Pakistan, but also during inside the UK and the US, where he was doing a lot of these like charitable drives. And so that's kind of what brought him into politics. What can be understood as this idealistic, vision for helping people, and he really um, always kind of put a people-centric mandate as his party's foundation.
I
And
agree.
so,
I think he went through, oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just
no,
gonna
no, no,
say,
that's okay, that's okay.
I think he went through, or he tried to attack the political landscape not as a politician, but as an activist. And I agree.
Mhm.
He looked at it in a very people-centric fashion. So he was very, he considered like social programs extremely important. He put a lot of emphasis on healthcare. He put a lot of emphasis on education. He was also extremely handsome, very charismatic,
Yeah,
very well known. He was a celebrity. He came from this athlete background. So I think he kind of put a very different angle into, the political landscape of Pakistan, especially when you consider the fact that historically, outside of course, the Muslim League and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, over, the last, several decades, Pakistan has become a very military-based government. I think Imran Khan was trying to, have like a new turning point to that.
definitely, yeah. So and that, as you mentioned, he had all these traits which in any other country would have worked wonders for you. But he lacked that political legitimacy for a very long time. So from the mid to late 90s until all the way to into the early 2000s, he didn't really have any relevance in terms of his political standing. Excuse me. And so what he attempted to do was attach himself to popular causes, to popular figures. And after the 1999 coup that ousted Nawaz Sharif's government, and you had General Pervez Musharraf come in. For a time, I believe it was the first 2 or 3 years, Imran Khan was actually aligned with Musharraf as a way to gain that political legitimacy. But
And
then
that
he had to,
administration, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize. We have so much to cover. It's going to happen. We also have to remember that that administration was very aligned with the US. In a lot of ways, you could even say it was a US proxy at that time.
1000%. I mean, even proxy would be putting it lightly. It was embedded into, the Southeast Asian um, landscape to kind of function as a force, which he comes into power 2 years before 9/11 and the subsequent invasion of Afghanistan. But it was almost as if he came in at the perfect time to kind of prepare the ground, because if you had a regime or government in Pakistan that was hostile to U.S. interests, it wouldn't have boded well for the war on terror that was to take place. So there has been all sorts of conspiracies around this fact that um, Musharraf was brought in to kind of do the US's bidding, and to lay the groundwork that would make possible their invasion for Afghanistan, because they predominantly stationed their personnel in Pakistan when it came to intelligence gathering for Afghanistan. They were doing it all through Pakistan. Any of the supplies going into Afghanistan throughout the 2000s was going from Pakistan into Afghanistan through the tribal area.
And before you continue, I wanted to actually make this point. We also have to remember when it comes to the Islamic world, the only nuclear country in the entire Islamic world is Pakistan. And India, which is its neighbor and, sworn enemy for well, pretty much since partition, let's be candid, is also a
Mhm.
nuclear country. So I think the West has always had vested interest in keeping Pakistan in line. And you'll see that, throughout the decades of its history, that even when it tries to, I think, become independent and align itself with the Ummah per se, like the Muslim world, the
Mhm.
US is very keen on keeping it in line because it is a nuclear power. So I think it's a catch
Definitely.
22 that Pakistan is a nuclear power. So it has, these capabilities that other countries don't, but it also kind of makes, I guess, the Western world, NATO countries, if you will, keep an eye on it like a hawk.
For sure. And again, with the conspiracies, there has been this idea that Nawaz Sharif, whose government was there before Musharraf, and he was the guy who gave the go-ahead for Pakistan to finally test their atomic weapons, which they had developed, over the last 20 years previously, but they had not gone outright and declared that they're a nuclear power, or tested the nuclear weapons. And up until that point, this is something that was a contentious issue for the reason that it would displease the U.S. and all sorts of aid and incentives that Pakistan received from the U.S. And it's been said that at the time, during the late 90s, when Pakistan finally, declared that they held nuclear weapons, that the Clinton administration was deeply, deeply unhappy about this. And again, it's said that because of that, Musharraf was kind of earpicked to be the guy to replace Nawaz Sharif. Um, and so, what I wanted to give all that insight was for the reason that Imran Khan kind of enters into the political relevance during the 2000s against this backdrop of American presence in Afghanistan, being ethnically aligned to that region in terms of the tribal regions of the KP province. He had this affinity towards the people there, but he also was very directly confrontational when it came to American presence, and understanding that it was because of the US's role in Afghanistan in terms of destabilizing it, in terms of, being an occupational force for whatever interest that they were trying to engineer there, it was having a direct ramification on everything, in terms of the socioeconomic, political reality of Pakistan as well, because you just constantly, during the 2000s, I remember as a kid visiting Pakistan, and it was just always one of those issues that there was a threat. You couldn't go to Jummah prayers, Friday prayers, because it was like the mosque could be targeted. Things that we've recently seen happening again. That was throughout the 2000s, very, very commonplace that you had acts of extremist violence take place.
And we're going to get into the geopolitics and the international relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan much later, but this is setting the precedents for what we are seeing today. As a byproduct of Pakistan's role in aiding the US when it came to the war in Afghanistan, the quote unquote war on terror, the ramifications of that was very real because there's still heavy, heavy tension between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and that's causing both countries to geopolitically align with various different nations and creating a very fragmented region per se.
Definitely. And unfortunately, Pakistan's role in Afghanistan, it goes back even before that to the time of the Soviet invasion during the 70s and the 80s, and Pakistan being directly involved in, training and facilitating the quote unquote resistance to the Soviet communist um, invasion at the time. And that's kind of where you first see the collaboration between the American deep state in terms of the intelligence community there, the military, as well as the Pakistani military and the Pakistani intelligence services, the ISI. And that's kind of where everything comes together in terms of this, building this trust between their respective administrations, and kind of always having this understanding that we can work together, even if civilian governments in both the US and Pakistan don't see eye to eye. There's a deeper channel that's always there between the intelligence communities in both countries and the military. And then that's, again, something we'll get to later on, but that's what's kind of happening right now, in which Pakistan's military is taking center stage because they're playing off of those past relationships. But
Well,
going back to, yeah,
to be fair, when has Pakistan's government not had the military as the center stage? I do want to make that
that's no,
point.
of course, that's
Yeah.
definitely. I think what they do is they show their face at times and then they don't, right? They go back into the shadows and they let people do their in terms of the
But they're still holding the puppet strings. I do want to make that point.
always, always.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. And even when it came to Imran Khan, right? That's the price you have to pay, excuse me, when you want to come into politics, when you want to have any chance of winning an election, you have to, make some sort of compromise when it comes to the military, for sure.
Yeah, and that's actually the next question. Perfect segue. The next question that I was going to get into is I wanted to talk about the military deal between Imran Khan and the Pakistani military. Now, I know you and I don't have the exact information behind this, but from your understanding, what had happened between, the 2010s, if you will, when Imran Khan was very vocal about the role Pakistan played in the Afghanistan war and allying with the US leading up to him, running for election, right? Because in between that, there's a deal made between the Pakistani military and him.
Exactly, yeah. So he did campaign before previously in 2011, I believe, in 2013 as well. He was unsuccessful in both those in those attempts at winning the election.
And did he
Um,
run under the PTI platform in both regards?
he did always. So
Okay.
his party, the PTI, when it was formed in the late 90s, he's stuck by that
Okay.
since. But the thing with him was that, again, so to set the stage, during the early 2010s, he's become a very vocal advocate for the tribal communities in the frontier province and KP, he's become a very ardent um, critic of the United States in terms of their drone warfare that was, very apparent in its murdering of civilians in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. Um, and this sort of indiscriminate violence taking place day in, day out was there for everyone to see. And so he first
Actually, and I
mobilized.
wanted to make a point on what you just said. We have to remember that obviously the war on terror, if you will, was the US versus Afghanistan. But Pakistan being an asset, right? And I use that term really loosely, an asset of the US, where Pakistan was being utilized to, I can easily just say like subjugate Afghanistan. There's no better way to put it. And
Hmm.
yet Pakistan itself was being droned. And that's how heavy US imperialism goes. I always want to make that point. It doesn't matter if you're with them or against them, there's always going to be deep ramifications.
Definitely, definitely. And that's the question that Imran Khan asked. He said, what sort of sovereign, independent country allows for themselves to be bombed in the name of security, in the name of protecting them, as well as, civilians in Afghanistan? That this is a fight against, radical extremism that we're stamping out, as the US put it, as the Pakistani military would put it as well, in terms of their collaboration with the US, right? And so he called into question all these things. And I think it was around 2011, 2012, as well as 2013, when he started leading very, openly against U.S. imperialism in the region. And so he did a few very large, mobilizations, rallies that they took from Islamabad, and they marched all the way to Peshawar, to KP. And they kind of, said, we're going to, what they actually threatened to do was they were going to blockade the Khyber Pass that brings the supplies from Pakistan, in the military base, the American military bases in Pakistan, into Afghanistan, in terms of the supplies, in terms of, sustaining the American personnel that were based in Afghanistan for the last decade at that point. And so this was seen as a very troubling thing, but it did help him succeed, because in 2012, 2013, the election saw his party, the PTI, win. Power in the province of KP, and so they were able to set up their government there, and that kind of became the rallying cry for his, Naya Pakistan, that we have this political vision, and that we have finally succeeded in gaining legitimacy politically, and now we can kind of move that towards the whole country, as opposed to just, that core issue in the frontier.
And Naya
Um,
Pakistan is Urdu for anyone who's not like a native speaker. It stands for, or it means new Pakistan. And he was basically trying to bring in like a new generation of, the political landscape because it was so heavily aligned with imperialism. In the past, Pakistan was so heavily militant on so many different levels. So I think his goal under Naya Pakistan was to kind of make it not to make it sound like MAGA by any means, but it was putting Pakistani people first as opposed to its foreign interests.
Yeah, he was acknowledged as having this populist vision,
Correct.
for a
And
lack.
left-wing populism, not right-wing by any means.
Yeah,
We
so
have
it
to
was
always say
very,
that.
yeah, definitely. So it was very much so, about, as you said, social works programs, kind of people-centric policies. And we saw that take place in KP for the first time, in terms of how was he going to govern? What sort of vision did he have, right? But there's a lot of things to cover in terms of that as well, because within that, in terms of gaining legitimacy, he couldn't do it on his own. He couldn't bring in, people who were well intentioned, or politicians who saw, who aligned with his vision. What he basically did was he took people who were already part of the political infrastructure, who were part of the other opposing or ruling parties at the time, and he basically had those political actors come into the PTI, and it was almost like a process where they were, washed of their sins in terms of everything that they had done in the past. And that's kind of the point I want to make in terms of understanding Pakistani politics and going back to, our earlier discussion about where everything stems from in terms of why is the military so prominent? Why do you have politics set up in this way in this country? And it has to do with that consolidation of power amongst the elite through politics. People in Pakistan, they enter politics to make money, to kind of to secure their political and economic interests, whatever that may be.
Not
And
very
so
different from the government in the US, by the way, but yes, go on.
well, no, of course, yeah, and I mean, that's the thing. In the West, they have ways of dressing that up in all sorts of, language and rhetoric, and you kind of get lost in that. You forget what they're actually
You can just
doing.
say Nancy Pelosi and everyone knows what we're
Yeah,
talking
their
about. Yeah.
thoughts, right? Yeah, and but so a lot of these politicians in Pakistan, they're literally in politics to financially benefit themselves, and it's like an open secret. Everybody knows it that if you want to succeed in this country, you go into politics, or if you've succeeded enough, you're also going to go into politics or have some sort of political position because that's the best way to protect your own interests. And so this is the Pakistan that you're dealing with in terms of, this elite consolidation inside of politics. And Imran Khan, he kind of shifts gears away from this just being about, okay, I oppose American imperialism, I oppose these drones. I have this vision for a new Pakistan which where we're going to eradicate not just poverty, not just the issues that people have, very idealistic, this romanticized version of what the ideal Pakistan would be. But he's going to kind of, expunge all this corruption out of politics. He's going to stop the means through which these politicians are making money through their positions of privilege.
But he was
And that,
outspoken on two things, right? He was outspoken in terms of domestic policy, putting people first and the social welfare, the programs, attacking the corruption, right, within that government. But he was also very outspoken on, foreign relations or foreign policy. So one thing that I really appreciated about him was he had a very Ummah-centric, like Ummah, view where Pakistan should align itself with the Muslim world and help out other Muslim nations and their welfare for the sake of uniting the Muslim world. And we very rarely have seen that throughout the history of these Muslim nations after, I'd say what, like the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, even like from the time of partition. So I think that in itself was very notable. The second thing that he was very, outspoken about was Kashmir, which, is still till this day a very hot topic between India and Pakistan. And one of the main, not the only, but one of the main reasons that they go at each other's throat literally every other year. And then he was also very, very outspoken about Palestine, and we'll get into the ramifications and all that a little bit later. But him being vocal about all these issues, I think, is what made him so popular, but also led to his unfortunate, demise in politics.
undoubtedly, as you said, he had this political vision that was formulating during this time, and it wasn't just about a new Pakistan, but what he wanted to, and what he, persistently referred to was this sort of decolonization. And he talked a lot about mental slavery and kind of doing away with this mentality where you're putting, foreign interests before your country's own, where you kind of are always tied to pleasing these foreign actors, primarily the United States, as opposed to kind of building a self-sustained model. And so it wasn't, outrightly socialist in any sense, but at least he was talking about this in terms of having this mandate where people understood that they had an identity outside of this. And what he constantly referred to as well was the fact that Pakistan was so dependent, so severely dependent on American aid that came in the tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars that came in every single year, that the country was quite literally relying on to sustain itself.
And
And
but you see that
yeah,
until this day, because look at the amount of loans that Pakistan, like Pakistan is in a tremendous amount of debt. Let's just start with
yep,
that, even till this day. And the amount of loans that the US owes to the IMF as well as the World Bank, I mean, it is, I think, in the top five of like countries that utilizes those, programs, which is, I would like to also say, it's a form of indentured servitude. There's no liberation from utilizing these programs. So it's like the more that you utilize, the more debt you accrue, and it just turns into this like revolving door.
exactly. It's a repeating cycle, right? It's a never-ending cycle that you can't really get out of, and that's what he kind of wanted to do, right? He wanted to break those chains. He kind of wanted to break out of that dependence, that sort of cyclical dependence. And as you said, Pakistan, I think it's somewhere in the region of $95 billion in debt, and they keep taking on more debt to pay off the interest on the primary debt. So they're not even getting anywhere in terms of actually clearing off that debt. And so
You
they're
know
very,
how I actually explain it to people? So you know how they have like those predatory loans from like various different like credit unions, you know what I'm talking about? Where like you take a loan out and they're like, oh, we'll just give you 1,000 or 2,000. But then it's like if you don't pay it back within 2 days, you're gonna have like 7 million% interest. And that's how people end up accruing like insane amount of debt. That's exactly what the IMF and World Bank does, but to, I don't even want to say third world countries, but the global south per se. That's exactly what they do. It's bait. It's exactly how to describe it. It's bait, nothing else.
it's harrowing. And I remember reading recently that Pakistan's, I'm not sure if it's currently, but until very recently, it was still paying off debt for purchases of, I think it was F-16 fighter jets during the 1980s, and they had some sort of agreement with Saudi Arabia, who were lending them money. And it's bizarre when you think about it, because it's just such a high level of debt that you can't really climb out of. And of course it is, it's designed that way to keep these countries in debt, for sure. But there are things that, third world countries can do to kind of shackle that dependence. And Imran Khan tended to at least explore the idea of what could be done. And so he had some, I would say he at least entertained the idea that we can break out of this, and he spoke about it, because it was, and everything that he really talked about were things that nobody else within that political infrastructure, whether that's the People's Party or the PML Noon, the two largest political actors in Pakistan across the last 50 years or so, they didn't touch on these things. And so for him to
You know
come in,
what I didn't
yeah,
mean to interrupt you. I feel like that's going to happen a lot this episode. I
but
apologize. No, what I was going to say is, I think one thing that he also intrinsically understood is when you are taking out loans from the IMF and the World Bank, these are Western aligned institutions. That's the best way to put it. So as long as you are taking money from these institutions and you're accruing debt and it's turning into this revolving door where you're not able to get out of it, it's indirectly, or you can even say directly, putting you in line with its foreign interests. So you basically become, when it comes to geopolitics or, foreign policy, you become a puppet of the West because you have this indentured servitude or a multitude of loans, right, to these countries, right, these factions, if you will. And so I think he kind of understood that connection that as long as we keep taking this money and accruing this debt, we will be puppets of the West, and a lot of our foreign policy will be an extension of U.S. imperialism. I think he deeply understood that, and that is something that he ideologically was able to, build his entire like political platform on.
Exactly. He was very vocal on that, and he referred to it as a form of begging, where why do we need to go and beg these countries for their money? Why do we have to play this position when we can break out of it? And it kind of all comes together in 2011 when you have the raid that captured and killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan in Abbottabad. And that was a really fractious moment between Pakistan and the United States because up until that point, the US had, invested significantly in building this relationship with Pakistan to act as a sort of security buffer for the work that they were doing in Afghanistan, right? Um,
And
and you
politically,
have
this
this.
was so fracturing for Pakistan itself because you have to remember it the relation because the US was utilizing because the US was utilizing Pakistan in the war against Afghanistan. You have to remember that Pakistan, I guess you could say, hiding Osama bin Laden, now didn't just have fractured relations with Afghanistan. Now it also fractured, its relations with the United States. So it kind of screwed itself over, for lack of better terms, on both sides. And I think that the ramifications were really felt by the country, and that is something that Imran Khan heavily spoke on as well.
Yeah, so it's still unknown in terms of, what I actually like to think of it as is what, in terms of what would have happened, is that elements within the Pakistani, security state, within the military, might have actually known that Osama bin Laden was hiding there, right? And they may have looked the other way in order to let him, be there. But at the same time, I'm sure there were elements, who were actively working alongside the U.S. to find him, to, to basically defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan, which is a very weak sort of argument in terms of what they were actually doing because it was just massacring and butchering civilians for over 10 years.
But
Um,
it's important to discuss this for the following reason. Even when you're discussing, let's say, Lebanon, or you're discussing, for example, Yemen, you can't say Yemen collectively or Lebanon collectively leans one way or the other, right? Sometimes the government leans one way, but you have a multitude of different factions or groups within the country that lean the opposite way. And I think Pakistan was a byproduct of that. You obviously had a multitude of factions and people that were leaning towards aligning with the US and, being an extension of US imperialism, being utilized as, a proxy, if you will, against Afghanistan, right, in that war that was going on. But you also had internal factions that aligned itself with Afghanistan. And I think that's something that people honestly just don't discuss enough because you also have to remember, ethnically speaking, a big portion of Afghanistan as well as Pakistan have the same ethnic identity as well as the same ethnic, or not ethnic, excuse me, political beliefs. So as a byproduct of that, you do have factions within Pakistan that actually work with the axis of resistance. You have factions that align itself with Taliban or, Afghani interests. Then you have individuals who are, let's put Pakistan first. And then you have various different governments under different administrations that either are, usually pro-US, but in Imran Khan's case, it was anti-US imperialism. So Pakistan is one of those countries where it's not a monolith.
no, for sure. There's a lot of competing interests, there's a lot of conflicting ideologies at play. And as you pointed out, we can't really even know who's playing what side. And that's kind of what I think happened with everything related to Osama bin Laden. Because you have to remember whether it was bin Laden or a lot of these other sort of extremist, quote unquote extremist elements that were presiding in Pakistan, but also came into Afghanistan during the to fight the Soviet invasion, were trained and facilitated, armed by the United States um, through Pakistan, as well as Israeli intelligence. So you have this reality, right, where there's competing interests, but there's always been this hardline, sort of American loyalist element within the Pakistani military, and there just tends to be always individuals who rise up the ranks within the military who are very concerned about how Pakistan handles itself in relation to the United States. Because again, American, foreign aid to Pakistan as well as military aid to Pakistan. Pakistan's uh, over 70% of the budget for the state goes to the military. So when you have a sort of setup like that, it's going to be very difficult to break out of that, or
Which
at least for
actually,
you to
which
try to.
which mirrors the United States in a lot of ways. Because remember, we also have a very bloated military budget, which ends up affecting a lot of social programs, a lot of domestic affairs, and it ends up putting the U.S. in a multitude of wars that, I mean, in my opinion, it is slowly not being able to afford. But that's a totally different episode. But that all that conjecture being prefaced, we have to remember that whenever a country's budget is heavily built on, military expenses and, military based overall, it affects it not just in terms of foreign affairs, but domestic affairs as well. And usually it's very, very crippling for the people of a country because if, all your taxes and, the budget of a country is going towards the military, people that live there tend to suffer the most. We see that in the United States. And I think Pakistan, in a very big way, is a reflection of that as well.
100%. I mean, you have such a lack of social infrastructure. You have such a lack of basic necessities for the majority of the country. There's a lot of areas, especially outside of the Punjab, when you look at the KP province, when you look at Sindh, when you look at Balochistan in particular, these are areas that are very desolate, very, very cut off from any sort of, having any sort of infrastructure present. And they're also hotbeds of again, extremism in terms of political radicalization, in terms of violence, and there's a clear correlation between all these aspects, right? But again, the establishment that has always existed in Pakistan, they function or they're able to sustain their position because they ignore these factors. Because again, all this money that's coming in is lining their pockets, and they have a vested interest in keeping things a certain way.
The status quo per se. No, absolutely. The next question that I actually had for you is, so we talked heavily about Imran Khan and his rise to power, as well as him opposing U.S. imperialism and addressing domestic as well as foreign policy issues. Now that all
Sorry,
being
just to cut
said,
in, there's one thing I did want to add to that.
oh no,
Uh,
go on. I apologize.
just quickly. So in terms of his Naya Pakistan, in terms of his vision for a new Pakistan, and he's asking people, in a lot of his discourse, he was calling on people to do certain things in terms of how they thought about themselves, how they thought about Pakistan as a country. And again, these ideas of breaking out of mental slavery in terms of decolonization, breaking the shackles and chains of dependence on the United States. He, as you mentioned before, he kind of wanted to instill this new identity in Pakistani people. And so he gave the example of Turkey in particular, and he saw that as a proud, upright people, and that's something that we can channel here too. And so Pakistan was able to build very strong relations with Turkey in general, whether that's Imran Khan's government or the People's Party or Nawaz Sharif. They all were able to kind of do that and play into that because again, he spoke about this, this romanticized version of an ummah and kind of a golden period that existed before, and we can kind of bring that about again. And in order to do that, we have to kind of, go through these steps and break our dependence when it comes to foreign. Foreign powers. But I think where, as we'll probably discuss now, but where he kind of lacked in was his practical application of a lot of these ideas into actual policy.
And
Um,
actually, before we get into that, I feel like all our episodes are going to be like this. There's just so much information. I always find geopolitics very interesting for this very reason. It's interesting to me that Imran Khan was so pro, like, okay, we need to decolonize, we need to be against US imperialism. I'm very pro Palestine. And, like I guess you can say Pakistan and Turkey were always actually really good economic and political allies, but it really strengthened under Imran Khan. I found irony in this, and I'll tell you why. Turkey is also very, very close allies with Azerbaijan, which is allies with, Israel. And I think it's like 40% of the oil, right, that is utilized or utilized in Israel comes from Azerbaijan. Also, it's interesting because Turkey is very, very Western aligned and it's a NATO member. But the reason I'm bringing this up isn't to say that everything, we're discussing under Imran Khan is hypocritical. I think it's more to say geopolitics is just very, very, very complicated and it's never going to be black and white. There's always going to be gray areas. And the more that you learn, the less you realize you understand.
Uh, I, I mean, yeah, I couldn't have said it any better. It can get very confusing. The complexities are they're right there, and I think week by week things change so quickly. And actually on that subject, I believe in the last 2 weeks or last month, Pakistan signed new agreements with Azerbaijan as well as Uzbekistan for
Wait, I didn't even know that. Okay,
yes,
yes,
for
we'll definitely go into that.
agricultural deals. So again, there's all sorts of things happening.
Under this administration, though, that doesn't surprise me. This is also the same administration that, and I say this with a lot of embarrassment as a Pakistani, nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. So these agricultural, deals per se is not something that surprises me. But that being said, let's get back to because I feel like we're jumping around. Let's get back to Imran Khan, and like do it in chronological order. So we discussed, his views on domestic policy. We've, discussed his views on foreign policy and the intricacies that come with that. What do you think kind of led to that internal opposition from the military and the internal government of Imran Khan? Because, like you were just saying, and I didn't mean to cut you off, he viewed politics through the lens of an activist, but like you had just said, there was a lack of application as a politician that I think led to a lot of his demise per se.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that outlook that he had, he had built on, kind of the disillusionment that people had with the establishment politicians and the political parties that already existed, and he played off of that, and he was able to succeed in winning. Into coming into power, but he wasn't able to build on that because he lacked in having a practical economic mandate in particular, and a lot of his policies were all over the place. And there was other things with a lot of issues around dealing with ethnic minorities like the Hazara, as well as there's all sorts of bigoted, sexist remarks and issues around misogyny that came about from politicians associated with him or his government or himself. Again, just problematic and unnecessary things that really didn't have any sway when it came to his politics, but he felt he needed to kind of appease certain sections of the country. And so he did a bit of that where he um, kind of, especially like the clerical class in Pakistan, in terms of the hardliner, extremist interpretations of Islam, adherence to that sort of philosophy. He was kind of adamant that he needed to appease them in particular, and that kind of got a lot of people to point fingers and kind of question what his political vision excuse me exactly was, why he felt the need to do certain things, as well as the decision making that went into that as well. But within his government, when he was making a lot of the decisions when it came to appointments, he built a track record where he put in people who were not well equipped to handle the positions that they were given when it came to things like the chief minister of Punjab. When it came to his economic advisors, he uh, there was one individual, I'm forgetting his name, but he was a very highly regarded economist in Pakistan, and he had a very clear cut vision in terms of how he could deliver Imran Khan's understanding of breaking away from dependence on foreign aid in terms of getting out of this mess with the IMF and the World Bank loans. And unfortunately, he was sidelined to make way for someone else because the clerical class in Pakistan were unhappy that he belonged to a certain minority group. And so it was kind of just small acts like that that kind of disgruntled a lot of people who I guess has supported him, voted for him, and so his policies were all over the place. But in terms of his main economic policy, it was like, we are not going to go to the US. We're not going to go to the IMF. We're not going to play on their terms. We're going to try to do this ourselves. And for a time being, it was successful because they had built on the previous governments that had come in. They'd built on the relationship with China, and they were able to kind of really entrench themselves in that relationship with China in terms of the CPEC project that Pakistan has in terms of building all sorts of energy infrastructure projects across the country, and developing places like Gwadar Port to make Pakistan a bigger player economically in the region. And that's something again that it attracted the ire of the United States. They weren't happy with Pakistan aligning economically so closely with China, and Imran Khan, he did build on that, but because of his refusal to do the practical, necessary things in terms of managing the day to day, when it came to curbing inflation rates, helping people, just find relief economically, he wasn't able to do that because he refused to go by the World Bank and the IMF playbook in terms of the conditions that they were offering. And so his refusal to do that really left a lot of people frustrated because, again, you have soaring prices, especially when it came to day-to-day use things like wheat, and especially when it came to petrol in terms of natural gas. These prices were astronomical in terms of the expenses,
Yeah, and
and
one
this will
way that
kind of, yeah.
I apologize. One way that I explain it to people is when it came to conjecture and theoretical, ideas, he was phenomenal. The foundation was there. But when it came to praxis or like putting it into action, that's, I think, the failure that we saw. And as a byproduct of that, the very same people who supported him started becoming really disgruntled because, when there's like a slow economic collapse, that's now affecting the same people that were hoping that things would get better as opposed to worse.
Yeah, and it's always there to see, right? As much as you might talk a good game, as much as you would, you want to talk about American imperialism or like breaking away from the US, but then when someone goes to get groceries, right, and they can't even afford that, excuse me, they can't afford that anyways, and they see the prices only going up and up, or if they can't afford the petrol that was already too expensive for them, it's gonna make for a bigger issue, right? And that coupled with a lot of the politicians in his party who, he had taken from the same corrupt parties that he had been against
Criticized.
for so long. Yeah, exactly. And so he took those same people on, and they started doing the exact same things that they were doing when they were in those parties. And so it really did make for a sort
You
of,
can't change, you can't take an old, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I think that's basically what it sort of came down to.
And again, that it's the game that he was playing, right? If he wanted that political legitimacy, if he wanted to actually build a support base, he needed those politicians. And so he brings them into the party, but then this is the price that he pays, that people are like, this is a bit hypocritical, where you talked about, stamping out corruption, but then you have members or people affiliated with members of your party, profiting off of their positions, profiting off of all sorts of things that the government was doing. And so, unfortunately, that's the way things are structured in Pakistan as a country. And it's very difficult to break away from that. And you would probably need a far more aggressive approach. And he had that choice, right? He had that choice of building a sort of grassroots movement, which might have taken a decade or two more. But that was the deal he cut, to my understanding, is that he allowed not only those politicians to come into his party to, give him that vote bank immediately from whatever constituencies they represented, but also in terms of the military, who had the ear of certain individuals, certain of these individuals, and they were able to assure that whatever interests they had would also be aligned with whatever it was that Imran Khan saw as doing for himself.
You know how I kind of explain it to people? He was preaching a revolution on like a multitude of different levels, but he struggled to bring about reform, not because I think he had bad intentions by any means. I know a lot of people say that. I personally don't agree with it. But that being, prefaced, I think the issue that we're running into is the fact that there needed to be a catalyst and a much bigger change internally speaking. And like you said, it would have taken a grassroots movement internally, and it would have taken another decade or two, maybe even three, to make significant change. And he was trying to bring about reform in a government that had no place for it. And I think that's, one of his biggest failures, per se.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. He saw that he had a chance to get into power, and maybe this is a fault of his that isn't talked enough about. That he kind of had this desire to win, and he ignored the fact that he was coming into a political system, into an infrastructure where it isn't just corruption in terms of the government that takes place, but you have the military playing a very active role in, what happens, what doesn't happen, and deciding those things. And so when you have these like, multitude of factors coming into play and you're just ignoring them because you have this idealistic version or vision of what you want things to be, and that because I'm talking this in this way, it's just going to happen magically. And I think he was kind of victim to that, and he chose to ignore it. Right, he chose to ignore the fact that there would come a time where the military would want certain things done, or they would not agree with some of his decisions, and he didn't really think about that. I'm guessing he saw more so that, okay, this is my gateway to winning this election. I'll do whatever they want. And the way it works, from my understanding, is that the military actively helps in repressing not only votes, but in terms of, breaking opposition parties, in terms of fracturing them internally, and assuring that, a certain political outcome occurs. And so it isn't always, that they're uh, going out there and destroying votes, or,
So
uh,
what he's essentially saying in a very eloquent way is that the government is very corrupt.
everyone's corrupt. That's the
Yeah,
thing.
there's
And
just
everyone's
no
in
way
it for
around it.
themselves, right?